It's obviously an honor to be able to tell you a little bit about me. And interesting, when you think about that, I had no idea when I came to this country for 1 year in 1969. I'm still here. It's been a long year. But what really is the interesting part about it is that in 1993, when I initially started to talk about City Tavern and talk to the National Park Service, and started to kind of do some research. And I will honestly tell you, I was flabbergasted when I read the opulence and the sophistication that was around in the 18th century. Obviously, since I worked for the National Park Service in tandem, I had tremendous amount of information at my fingertips. So it helped me tremendously to really understand. And every day was a new wow, wow, wow. Couldn't believe it. And so I did the research together with great help of Kerry Deaton and some other people, curators of the park, to understand the difference between a tavern and the tavern of the 18th century, which John Adams called the most genteel tavern in America, which is the City Tavern. So what's interesting about this whole thing is that as a European, honestly, we really, during my era, I should qualify that, we look down a little bit on what we consider American cuisine, because mostly we saw it in Europe that the Americans like their fried chicken, their burgers and steaks, and that was the end of that. And nothing could be further from the truth. But anyway, so when I dug into it deeper and deeper, and to understand the understanding between the difference between the Tan Tavern and the Indian Inn Tavern and the Sun Inn of Bethlehem and those taverns and the City Tavern, it was very obvious that that City Tavern was created and built and designed by an English architect to be right next to the harbor, because in those days, where the location was very important. And so a lot of food stuff that some people found later on saying, it's kind of weird that you would have this on your menu. They didn't realize that the stone throw away from the City Tavern was the harbor. So obviously the chefs at the City Tavern at the time had nutmeg and allspice and lemons and everything at their disposal that most other people wouldn't even get until much later. So this has helped. But in the initial stages, trying to come up with a menu that was kind of in keeping, we must remember that Philadelphia era was settled heavy by the Germans, so there was a good amount of German in the inner structure, not because I'm from Germany, nothing to do with that, it's just that it was there. So we incorporated some of that. And the other thing is that most people don't realize, which was very important for me in developing the menu, that the French helped the revolution tremendously. Some of you that dwell in history like me, you obviously know that. And so the French were very welcome. So with the revolution breaking out in Paris, a lot of the French people made their asset liquid and went to some of the islands that they were working on before, brought along their help, and guess where they settled? They're settled right on Second Street. Matter of fact, the local French would call it La Petite Champs-Élysées, which means the small Champs-Élysées, because it was all French, all up and down from the City Tavern all the way up to Christchurch. And you had ice cream shops, and you had bakeries, and you had dance studios, and you had translating services, a little bit of everything. But usually the French adapted into it. So it's not unusual that you would find on my menu French dishes, which later then I found out was not so unusual, because Hannah Glasse, which is my mentor, if you will, because she published her book in 1745, had many of the recipes, such as working with pafto and lobster bisque and reductions of different things, and using some of the herbs. The difference is that Philadelphia was more blessed than London, because London was too far away from the West Indies. So things that we took for granted or got, she wouldn't have had. such as some of the tropical foods, obviously sailing time from the big islands of Jamaica to the inner fabric of Philadelphia, a day and a little bit. So a lot of stuff was available. So that was all kind of really surprising to me. And the more I read and the more I got into it, and the more I said, wow, I can't believe it. So I became an ambassador of what I would consider 18th century cuisine, because it was all available. Now, I will qualify that when I talk about 18th century, I talk about the upper echelon. I talk about I cooked. I'm one of the only chefs that I know of that cooked in the first 5 presidents' homes. Matter of fact, I would say to you that Monticello and Susan Stein, which was the curator at Monticello, are actually extremely important to me personally and my show, because the first episode that we filmed in Monticello got us immediately 2 Emmys, and boom, we kept on rolling. So going back, I'm jumping back and forth a little bit between the City Tavern and my show, A Taste of History, because they're intertwined. And how they got intertwined, that in the beginning, the people, I had a really rough time when I opened in '94, because the previous operators did a horrible job and people didn't want to go near the City Tavern, because remember, you wouldn't believe when I tell you that there was microwave ovens and frozen food be served in there. They didn't have a bake shop. They served the regular old bread, and the pastry chef was Sarah Lee. So how do you expect that, especially in the 18th century, when bread and desserts were so important part of the diet, and plus the beverages as well. Obviously, we'll come to this in a little bit. So haven't put this all in perspective and putting it all together, people would eventually come back to the tavern and experience the good food and the good meal and really got excited. And then many people had said to me, oh, you do so much, and we did a lot of television. I had another program that's called Cuisine of the Black Forest and some other things I did. And people said, you should really put this program together so that people understand. And therefore, the show was born, called A Taste of History, which now we are right now presently, because of COVID, unfortunately, we didn't film last year. So right now we're rerunning season 11, but we are on the verge right now to start with season 12. Our first step will be up in Bethlehem, which we couldn't finish last year because of COVID. And then we have a whole series of from Texas to the Santa Fe Trail to many other exciting locations that we are right now plotting. And by mid-June, we should be able to run. Everybody got their shots, everybody is ready, and the country is waking up a little bit. A lot more people are excited about us coming there again. Some of the international locations we are still on hold, like Madagascar, the Philippines, and Peru, which was initially on our program, but we just couldn't make it happen. Matter of fact, the last show we did was last year in February at Ecuador, just as the COVID crisis broke out all over the world. But so going back, so when I talk about affluent, and I will tell you that the average person by design almost were vegetarians, kind of like meaning when they had an opportunity for protein such as hunting or trapping, whatever they got, or fishing, they would have it. But many times, many of the meals that I researched initially was basically a lot of the beans were used, obviously natural proteins, and a lot of vegetables. Now the vegetables are seasonal. Remember, we are talking about pre-canning, we're talking about pre-airplanes, we're talking about pre-freezers. So they were really working in tandem, which did not mean, by the way, that they were not creative. There's such a things as leeks that can winter outside, French lentils, which are very green and beautiful. So the chefs at the time were really creative. And speaking of creativity, obviously, in one of my books, I've written 7 books, 4 that we sell still right now, and the other ones are out of print. But you'll find in the City Tavern book that I dedicated it to Thomas Jefferson, just because I'm a big fanatic about him and the amount of research he did, and his gardening and the exploring and the traveling. And also, when you think about, he'd taken his chef all the way to France just to learn how to make pommes frites, or we call them French fries, and to make crème brûlée and floating islands and all this other good stuff, which is very difficult to explain. It was difficult to explain to me, by the way, to the Park Service, the National Park Service, because it took me, I don't know, 5 years to get French fries on the menu, even so I could show them and prove the fact that Jefferson took James Hemming all the way to Paris to learn those trades. And then obviously he also traveled the south of France. He discovered the great wines of south of France. He discovered upland rice. But when you read his books, especially the books on gardening, you understand how the man was possessed with trying to bring new products into Virginia at the time. And anybody that has 28 varieties of peas obviously should get an award from me, because he was so into it. So needless to say, and when I talk about, I never talk about politics. All I talk about is culinary. And so if somebody says, well, Jefferson here and Jefferson there, it's had nothing to do with that. It has to do with his creativity and his, I would say, maybe demanding demeanor of what he wanted and when he wanted to eat. I mean, I did many episodes since that, also in Monticello. And when you study Jefferson, he was a man that had a lot of discipline. Think about it, he made it up to 84. Obviously, he had a lot of problems with arthritis. Matter of fact, in 1818, he went all the way to Hot Springs, Virginia, and sat in the sulfur beds for a couple of weeks, which helps. And I can relate to it, because I have problem with one of my knees with arthritis. So I kind of understand how sulfur is really helpful. But in general, when you think gardening and research and obviously wine and many things, people sometimes say to me, well, you only talk about the good things about Jefferson, what about the mistakes? Honestly, when he made a mistake, he admitted it. He was trying to develop sesame oil, and you didn't have the machinery to squeeze the oil out of the sesame seeds, and therefore he let it go. But and many other vegetables that he grew maybe didn't go to his liking, then he stopped doing them. But remember, he had a network of people that supported him with different seeds and different spices. And if you ever had a chance to go to Monticello, if you haven't been, you must go. You must see the garden, because quite frankly, it was an experimental garden. And speaking of gardening, before I'll do some more other insight, is kitchen gardens. As we know today, and I filmed kitchen garden in Pennsbury, kitchen garden at Mount Vernon and others, were not shown off at the time. The ornamental gardens were shown off. This is kind of our English upbringing. And the kitchen garden was not shown off, but it was kind of expected, because when you got invited into a state like that, you would obviously have beautiful food and a lot of variety, which is another thing that takes people into a loop. When you understand the amount of varieties that were served on a given table, it wasn't like we eat today. Boom, 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 just one meal or two meals. In those days, you had like 15 to 20 different dishes per interval. And many of the better estates would have up to 3 intervals. Then the beverages, they played another big part, because at the time, water you couldn't drink. And so a lot of ale was drunk, and obviously Madeira, cognac, and a lot of rum that was dealt with and the waterfront in Philadelphia, because a lot of the sailors got paid in rum. So they would go around and haggle their case of rum. Now, the other thing of interest where I found tremendous amount of inspiration, where I'm calling you from right now, was actually Charles Thompson's estate. Now, Charles Thompson was the secretary of the Continental Congress. And his last mission, and only mission that everybody remembers him by, besides he designed the seal of the United States, was going all the way to Mount Vernon and telling George Washington, hey, you got elected as president and I retire. So I'm actually living right across the street, literally, from the Harrington estate. Now, what's interesting about that is the Harrington estate was the escape for Thomas Jefferson. And by all accounts, now I don't know this for a fact, because obviously I cannot talk to to Jefferson or to Charles Thompson, but I think his love of gardening started right here in Bryn Mawr. Why? because Charles Thompson was a big beekeeper and a big gardener at heart. Plus, he translated the Bible. Just an unbelievable human being. And Jefferson, when Philadelphia, you got to remember, when Philadelphia got nice and smelly in the summertime, when you think about no sewage, no nothing, pigs running around, chickens running around, human waste. So he would ride his horse out to Bryn Mawr and spend 3-4 days or a longer weekend. And like all of our 18th century heroes, or my heroes, everything was very well documented. So I can actually had access to read the papers where Charles Sumner would say, oh, by the way, TJ, stands for Thomas Jefferson, is coming over next week. Let's make sure we get some oysters. Let's make sure we have enough champagne. Let's make sure we have everything, because they would eat and really enjoy and talk about philosophy. So gardening, that it's not 100% convinced, but gardening started, hopefully, or most people say the love of gardening would have come to the time that he spent over here with Charles Thompson. And I've keep on continuing. And then obviously him, being that he was a big Francophile because he enjoyed good food, he enjoyed good wine. He obviously fell in love with it during his time in France. So did everybody. Maybe John Adams was the least often, because John Adams was a really down-to-earth kind of guy, eating basic food and traveling a great deal. His poor wife was running the whole orchard and producing all the cider. And George Washington, when people always ask me, well, you don't talk much about culinary and George Washington. Yeah, because I'm talking about Mother Washington. Mother Washington was the best. Mother Washington enjoyed great recipes for great cakes, great entertaining, and just everything. George Washington never went anywhere but one place in his entire life outside this country. He went to Barbados as a young man. He was only 19 years old, to accompany his half-brother who had tuberculosis, and went along. And that's about the only place he'd been to it. And by all accounts, he was a straightforward eater. We'd call it maybe today meat and potato kind of guy, but and she was more the opposite. Plus, obviously, they consumed. There was always a Virginia ham on the table. Actually, she would have ate 400 hams a year, so you have one for every day and a couple of extra ones. And also, you have to remember that when he later retired, the estate had up to 300 overnight visitors. So it just basically was a resort. And she designed, together with some of the architects, the proper kitchen to support it. And I was also lucky to be able to cook in their kitchen. And it's just spectacular setup. And also, everything is so well documented. The Historic Association that runs Mount Vernon has done a spectacular job on researching and collecting the recipes, so it was easy for me to recreate. For the same situation also happened throughout, when you go to it. But going back, the average person obviously did not get to this level because the things were very expensive. But remember, they had the means to provide it. So 18th century food. Now this is going back to my early days in '93, reading some, trying to understand it. Half the time I thought I'm not going to believe it. It was just, to me, unbelievable, because I said, wait a second. We always were learned in school, and when I grew up in a restaurant. Matter of fact, we fed a lot of the GIs after the war that occupied Germany. I'm from the Black Forest area. We had some, not too many. Mostly we were French occupied. But anyway, so we had this understanding that the culinary powers in America by and large wasn't as great. There was little here, little there. And when you go through the history and you look at it, what happened, and it's understandable to me, as we said earlier, the Thompson history, it's understandable. The revolution of this magnitude was no small thing. And I'm sure that the people of means would not going to be second fiddle. In other words, I'm sure they wanted to show off too. And I think this is exactly what had happened. They pulled out all the stops, and things were just actually done spectacular. Now, I don't know if some of you have watched my show. I cook right across the street, literally, when I'm not on the road, at the Charles Thompson's estate. Kitchen was built in 1704, and everything on the set is exactly what it used to be. Short of me, obviously, I'm way too young for that, and I wear a uniform because, quite frankly, we could never find a good understanding of what would have been worn. I mean, some people will disagree. They say, well, there's certain pictures of Washington chef when he was in Philadelphia. He dressed kind of fancy, but nobody knows. And those are the things that must be left alone. One of the things that I've done in my entire time as being the executive producer of the show and the host is, if I don't know anything, I'll say it up front. I don't imagine it or I don't add into it. I kind of keep it, I say it the way it is. And usually what happens, because I say it the way it is, it comes out the way it is, and it's not scripted or changed differently. And I just believe it. And I stay away from things that are controversial. But in the same token, I also will tell you that cooking in the 18th century was a lot of work. There I tell you, and a lot of people it took to make it happen. Now, unfortunately, you couldn't go back to me and say, well, they didn't pay me anything. Correct. I understand all that, but that's not what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with the culinary sophistication and the culinary powers that existed. And you think about it that when you have a beehive, the beehive can never get cold completely because it can quack and it would be too difficult to heat again. So there was a job that all night long, somebody would put a little bit more wood in it to keep it at temperature. So those are the things that we kind of don't even understand it. Or meaning also when you had a farm like Charles Thompson, literally across the street, and you had big wood cellars. Now he was lucky, he had a wood cellar, different variations of wood cellars. But he also wanted to make sure that he had enough product for him to go through. It was a trial and error, because if he sold too many things on the open market and he didn't have for himself, that didn't go good. So there was a lot of thinking, the process was, well, how much do I need? How many carrots do I need? How many potato bushels do I need to feed my place for the entire winter until spring comes in again and a new crop comes about? You know, speaking of new crop, everybody asks me always constantly, am I aware that asparagus, am I aware? But of course I'm asparagus. Thomas Jefferson used to be dying for asparagus. So did everybody else because it was queen. I mean, lentils were queen and leeks was not the same. Brussels sprouts as well, you kept them under stock in the frozen. But asparagus is a sign of spring, and so many other herbs that came along with it. And, you know, it's just, don't ever for one moment think that the table was dull. It was colorful, and there were flavorful and other things that were available, and same with all the herbs. The herbs, when you dry them, they maintain the flavors. So nowadays, they go in a Ziploc bag in somebody's freezer, but in those days, it didn't exist. So you bundle them up and you hang them in a dry space, and hopefully right next to the burlap bag that would have your Marseille beans or the black beans, whatever beans you have, because beans was a very important part. Matter of fact, one of Jefferson's favorite one was just a white bean soup with maybe some fat back or maybe some bacon into it. And again, the people, the average people would just have a white bean soup without any bacon, or maybe a little bit of bacon. It depending. It also depends where you were located, depending where you live. But I want to go back one more time about the location of the city tavern and why John Adams would say to Abigail that it was the most genteel tavern he's ever seen. It's because the harbor across the street, a lot of stuff came in, and the sea captains would use the city tavern also as a merchants exchange. It was the unofficial merchants exchange until 1834, when the actual merchant exchange opened right behind the city tavern. So what would happen is they would bring a bushel of something over from any of the islands and would say, hey, what can you do with that? So thinking about carambola, star fruit, think about mangoes, think about papayas, was already in Philadelphia, was already used. Matter of fact, chutney has a very short time span. It doesn't live long. what do the city tavern chefs do? They made mango chutney already. Think about all that and what's served. And so it was just because of its location. And since Philadelphia, the ships, the southern trade route would come in there and they would bring the spices along. And so you had a very flavorful cuisine, if you will, because it wasn't just plain. One of the questions I always gotten, and I'm sure maybe somebody will ask me that later, is how do I come that I have the West Indian pepper pot on the menu? Now, let me tell you what's interesting. I just finished a couple of days ago. I did a beautiful promo for the city of Philadelphia because we are very excited to honor the World Heritage City that we became a few years back. And I just redid the Philadelphia pepper pot, not the Philadelphia one with tribe, but the West Indian. And the West Indian one came very simply because the aide-de-camp, the people that came along, the people that had to help, many of them came from the West Indies. And therefore, that soup, which then I put on my menu, was the #1 selling soup. And the taro would be on the ships because it would obviously travel extremely well and it's very nourishing, and the different spices. So therefore, it made itself onto the city tavern menu and was the big seller. Now, I'm sure you all know that the city tavern, unfortunately, had to close last year because of COVID, and also not just because of COVID, also the building, which was built initially in 74, 75 to open for the bicentennial, the life safety, i.e. sprinklers, i.e. other things were no longer up to par. So the government felt that it needs to be completely restored, and that's going to take some time. What the future will hold, I don't know. I'm no longer there, so I'm not too privy. The building obviously will be maintained. It's going to be opening maybe again for a restaurant, or maybe it's going to be just a museum. I don't know, but the building is a very important landmark in history of our country. And when we think about the Continental Congress meeting there in 1774 and many other big events that took place, I mean, it was just too important not to have the building. But it was no longer feasible to operate it as a restaurant. Even so, our business was great, except last year, obviously, with COVID. We and everybody else got pretty much hurt. So. But it gives you a little bit of an idea where I come from, and I cannot say enough to you, not often enough, as a European, looking it down, or not looking it down necessarily, kind of not appreciating what American cuisine was at the time, and then seeing all this stuff was an eye-opener to me. And therefore, we've gotten so many accolades the world over, because my show also airs in Spanish countries, because we filmed several shows in Nicaragua, I filmed in Ecuador, and it's available on Amazon Prime in other languages and in Europe as well. And people say, wow, how to believe. Now, obviously, I intertwined the history a little bit of it, because obviously the history is always important. History in food is basically what it is. When you think about this country, a lot of transplanted people, what do the first thing they do? They want to look for their own food. Now, if you're obviously a German like me from the Black Forest, you only need eggs and flour, and you're in business. You can make yourself some specialty. But if you've been Asian descent, you had to first grow your bok choy and do that and do that. Not so simple. So when I go to different locations, we go deep into it, trying to understanding. And so people always appreciate the cuisine that they grew up with. Like people say, oh, it's like grandma made or mom made, and so it's kind of played an important part of it. But for me, the beauty of 18th century food is not to be completely. It's just spectacular. The word I use on the show is because there's so much that we didn't really understand, me early on, how the sophistication was taken and the beauty. And remember, the no equipment, no electrical equipment, nothing there. You have an open fire, you get a beehive and beautiful wrought iron pots and pans, and you can knock out some spectacular food, as I do on the show. And matter of fact, when I do it on the show, most of the time it's live to tape. It's not like pre-made or anything like that. We don't. So it's very interesting. And this part of the world, especially, well, not just Bryn Mawr, but Greater Philadelphia area or the Northeast, is so full of spectacular. I mean, from the beekeeping to all the apple orchards we have here, like the place that I'm sitting right now used to be a tobacco farm. Then it became a small grain farm, and then it became a dairy farm during Charles Thompson's time. So it gives you an appreciation for the 18th century, the foods of the 18th century. Obviously, today people put their nose up a little bit of some of the items that were eaten then because nothing was discarded. And I fully understand it. And that's where the Philadelphia pepper pot, where people say, well, that has to have tripe. I don't like tripe. It's not so. There's some recipes with tripe and some recipes with any other intestinal product. But obviously, tripe is the one that everybody kind of relates to it. And so it's nobody knows exactly. But I will tell you that nothing was discarded. Everything was eaten. The feet, the head, everything. So the people were very frugal. No question about it. Like people say to me always, well, what did it do for the chicken? And what the chicken was needed for the eggs, because the eggs were needed to bake bread, to make your cake. When the chicken got too old to lay eggs, stewing pot, there you go, next Sunday meal. That's kind of how it went down. And then everybody was like what I call micro farmers on a small scale, except the people who dwelt right into the city. They end up going to the market. And quite frankly, I spent a lot of time in Asia, in China per se. They're still working the same way. There's many Chinese families who have never seen a refrigerator. They go in the morning to the market, they buy what they need to cook it up. It's good enough for the night and maybe a little left over next day, and there you go. And they're twice fried. So the twice frying is again an 18th century method as well, because if you eat something that's not 100% and you get sick once, you learn pretty quick. So you make sure that you cook things twice. We call it twice cooked. So it's now common in Asian cooking, but it's already was very much around the 18th century as well. And naturally, when the other question I get, and maybe somebody has this question, how did they preserve? Well, between smoking and salt curing and sun drying, that was the routine. Now, sun drying, I remember as a kid, when we sun dried all of our food on big sheets. And I remember being maybe 6, 7 years old, my grandfather would say, Walter, quick, the rain clouds are coming in because it can't get wet. You got to take them all under shelter. But so dried food, which is now lately becoming an in thing again because people see how healthy it is because the vitamins will stay within it. And those are the kind of things. And we go on, like everybody right now is crazy about kimchi. Well, kimchi has been around for a long time. It's just what's called sauerkraut. So it's the same thing. It's just cabbage fermented with salt, and yet the vitamins don't go bad. So obviously, especially right this part of the world here, Philadelphia, Greater Philadelphia area. I mean, there's nobody in the New York State doesn't cook themselves pork and grout. I mean, this is just like a natural. So again, but it's been around already, and it was obviously used heavy on the ships because it helped curvy. Because the sauerkraut would travel extremely well, but then the vitamins would be out and would help the poor sailors. That and the tamarind. Just imagine being on a ship when nothing fresh is available anymore. They got stuck maybe in a couple of no wind situation. A lot of people got really sick and passed away of constipation until they figured out that tamarind is a natural laxative. That took a while too. So I mean, there's all kind of stuff that we have learned, and I worked very closely with some of the historians from the sea to understanding how it goes, because we filmed many different islands all over the world, and we learned a lot. Every show, to give you an idea, takes about 4 weeks or 5 weeks for me to research. I have obviously hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. My favorites are what I just said earlier, is Hannah Glass. There's a couple more. She isn't the only one, but she is my favorite. And I learned tremendous. Also, in cooking 18th century authentically, you don't have measurements. Your measurements are your hand. So depending how big your hand is, when you say a hand of that, a hand of that. So it's a little bit of trial and error, but you get the hang of it. So this gives you my little spiel. I mean, 7 books later, 4 still in print. Like I said, the Tavern is finished. I'm not finished. We're going to start filming again. We still have an e-commerce store where people still buy DVDs and books and stuff like that, and other things that we still have around. So we keep ourselves busy. And like I said, when my assistant, who is half my age or then some, he's the expert, and I was kind of nervous getting this organized today, because normally he sets it all up for me. But it's not the first time we did it, and it all worked. So I'm glad that it worked out. I'm a good chef, but I'm not a good what you call it, computer whiz. But so I'm all yours.
All right, thank you. So we have, I'm looking in the chat. Thank you, Chef Staib. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I'm going to be looking in the chat to see if we have questions and comments for you, and then I will share them with you. Please remember, this is being recorded for our website, so we're asking you to please use the chat. So Sally Lane recommended that if you want to add to your Jefferson food references that you mentioned in your papers, he mentioned in his papers during his presidency of ordering his macaronis of Sartori in Trenton, and that pasta making operation took place just south of the Trent House along the river. So thank you, Sally. A little bit of history coming from our audience. Anyone else that has comments or questions for Chef Staib or for the audience? Little tidbits of information around 18th century cuisine and cooking habits. It's interesting to learn how even today, some cultures are still using some of those same habits of the twice frying and non-refrigeration. So very interesting. And I learned about sauerkraut, new name, same ingredients. All right. I don't see anything in the chat. I did, Chef Staib, want to highlight, I'm gonna do a quick screen share of the slide. Oh, here we go. Louise would like to know, I'm curious if any changes in cutlery and technology have made changes in what kinds of foods were offered, that forks were not always used.
Well, the cutlery, I'll tell you what, I forgot to mention it. That's the other thing I will not use. I will not use 18th century knives. They are very dangerous, and I will maintain my own knives. The knives I use are, well, they're made actually in Germany, Henkel, but the knives was something, when you see 18th century knives, they're just difficult. As far as technology is concerned, there's nothing better, I will honestly tell you, nothing better than to cook in a wrought iron pot. The flavor and the heat, and remember also, when you watch my show, you see sometimes a little bit too much flame. This is just because we're trying to get you excited when you sit at home on your couch. Normally, you do not cook on a high flame. You basically let the fire almost simmer down, and then you could right next to it. Plus, the iron pot, the iron will actually pull the heat right into it. So many times when you watch my show, and you can, first of all, you can watch the show. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can watch them all 11 seasons. You can just click them in and see which one you like. So I think, sure, in my own house, I use French Cabaret, actually the same company that made the pots for Thomas Jefferson and for George Washington, Mauviel out of Paris. It's the same equipment I still use at my house. But in the open kitchen, you really don't use them. You use them for some. Interesting enough, when we talk, that's, like I said, you needed basically a day just to talk about what happened then and what happened now. There's just so much to cover. For instance, I give you one more, that is one that I usually try to tell people. When Thomas Jefferson lived in France, and he saw some of the finer sauces to be done by French chefs, and he had Hemmings learn it. The first thing he did when he came back to Monticello afterwards, when he retired, he built a stew stove. And what a stew stove was, as a matter of fact, I'm the only guy, this is the honest to God truth, the only guy ever to use it. So if you're looking at, go on Amazon Prime, first season, I think it's the 4th episode under Monticello. You see me with a historian. She has a PhD in African American studies. We work together very closely, Dr. Lady Thompson. We were the only time ever to use its stew stove. And I tell you why, because it has no exhaust. So everybody was worried about the carbon monoxide. Matter of fact, we had EMC, we had all kind of outside first aid there in case somebody was going to pass out. Nobody did. And what the stew stove was, is while you cook at the wrought iron cuts over the open fire, usually with a crane or any kind of device, the stew stove would be heated with charcoal that you take right out of the fire and for lower heat. And the stew stove would be about 38 to 40 inches high. And so the copper pots, the same company that was telling about Noviel that I use the pots, those same pots, they use then to reduce, to make reductions, any kind of reduction of sherry sauce or any kind of lobster piss, any kind of sauces that you do not want to have at a high heat, you could control it there. So again, now, having said that, Williamsburg has one, which is a reproduced one, but Williamsburg has many stuff that is reproduced, including hot dogs and hamburgers and nachos and all the things that I have never done or never will. But they have one which they put an exhaust, of course, so therefore they can show it to people. The one in Monticello was used only one single time by yours truly and Dr. Lenny Thompson. And actually, that episode gave us our first Emmy. That and I got one as a host. And most likely, I got one as a host. People didn't understand my accent, so I said, "Give him an Emmy. Let him go away." So when you ask about technology, they were pretty smart already. They were not born yesterday. The same other reason is the variety of pots to be used, when you use them, how you use them. There's a whole science to it. The only difference is that most of the kitchen all look the same. They look to be, there was like one designer. The only difference would be, like for instance, John Adams' kitchen has the beehive. I think it's on the right side, and all the other kitchens, the beehive is on the left side. So it's kind of like, and sometimes some beehives are exterior, and sometimes the beehive would open from the inside but build outside onto the building. So they would vary. The one thing that very seldom varied, there was a cook's quarter, usually adjacent to the kitchen, and that's just the reason for that some cook has to sleep there and maintain the fire. That's kind of like slept right on the sacks of flour, but that's kind of. But other than that, like I said, the knives, no, I wouldn't touch them, and everything else in it, they were pretty innovative. I mean, you got to remember one thing also: the amount of meals they had to produce, and there was no convenience food. It didn't just go quick and open a can of something. We didn't have any cans. We didn't have anything frozen. We had freezers, nature's freezers, and don't underestimate how much stuff was kept on the field. Story, when I was a kid, guess who had to go and get the Brussels sprouts? Yours truly. My grandfather said, "Go, Walter, go pick some Brussels sprouts." See, my finger were blue because you let the stock right be out there and it freezes, and then you just break off the little Brussels sprouts. So those are the kind of things,
Wow,
All right. Hopefully that answers the question.
And some, thank you. Andrew said he used to enjoy the flights of beer at City Tavern. And can you talk about the selections provided by Yard's Brewery?
Can you say it one more time? I have a difficulty.
I'm sorry, I apologize. The beer at City Tavern, can you talk about the selections provided by Yard's Brewery?
Okay, but actually we didn't, we kind of moved really quickly over it early when I said beverages. Okay, here you go. When I did my research initially, obviously, as we said, nobody drank the water. And so basically everybody was making one form or another form of ales. And I found out that the New York Public Library and the Precious Book Department had a recipe for George Washington's, what he calls a porter, or he called it a small beer. We went to New York, we paid the money to get the recipe, the copy, went back, and then Yard's company, which was a tiny, tiny little company, headquartered in Manayunk, in a garage, matter of fact. They were starting experimenting. So we experimented, took us a long time to get the flavors right, working with the recipe. We did the same thing with Benjamin Franklin, where we had a really good recipe in his archives. And also Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's was a little different because he had help of an English brewer that came over twice a year. And there were kind of variety of recipes available. So we kind of merged the two of them together. And the fourth one is what we call an IPA, which is basically everybody made. We call it Alexander Hamilton for no other reason than give it a historic name to it. But George Washington, 100%, Thomas Jefferson, 99%, because we're not sure exactly where we left off. And then after the Ben Franklin, the spruce beer, 100% by his books. But it wasn't just beer, it was also Madeira, as I said earlier, and a lot of rum drinks. And the most important drink of the 18th century would have been most likely a drink that's called Schwab, which I sometimes, when I don't say it right, people think, what is he saying? Schwab, like a shrub that grows out in your yard. And what Schwab is all about is a pickberry, whatever. In the city tavern, I had a variety of them, and in the end, I basically just stayed with raspberry. It was the easiest flavor to get, and it's made for one company forever in Centerville, PA. And what it is, they take the fruit, make it into a syrup, then let it naturally ferment. In other words, it attracts the yeast and it turns into vinegar. And as a vinegar base, it can store indefinite. So then when you make it for a drink, you take the vinegar and you take simple syrup, which is nothing more than sugar that you boil with water and mix it in together. So therefore, the aristocratic people would champagne, which was plenty of champagne in this country already. And the more common folks, maybe rum or nothing at all. Matter of fact, my good friend, the governor, ex-governor and mayor of the city, who is a teetotaler, doesn't really drink anything, but he would love a glass of Schwab because the acidity was just perfect, especially when you have to talk a lot and you get dry. So those are the kind of things. But there's much more. You had the warm drinks in the wintertime. You had the eggnog that the Germans brought over. Matter of fact, the eggnog was first introduced at the city tavern as a breakfast drink. Imagine with all the liquor in there. You must have felt no pain after you had a couple of sips of eggnog. So beverages was a very important part. And going back to the beers, obviously Yards should be, now they obviously got really big. They got a huge facility and Spring Garden, but started off very small and with a lot of, and I was insisting on getting beverages that fit the era as well. It wasn't just like the food, because it always has to be intentional. There's another thing, which was the uniforming and the tabletops, which are all so important to put the whole package together. I hope it answers it.
Yes, and I think my mom would love to try the eggnog. She's a big eggnog fan. Louise asks, what kinds of people came to City Tavern in the 18th century? Was it only men? She also added that William Trent lived in a house across the street from City Tavern for a time and wondered if he ever would have eaten at the City Tavern.
Okay, for some reason I have difficulty hearing you, but I think I got it. Okay, that's the interesting situation. By and large, remember, City Tavern, okay, first of all, I have to tell you, Tavern comes from the word tabernacle, that stands for sanctuary. And the City Tavern had 5 sleeping rooms upstairs. And matter of fact, when everybody always said George Washington slept here, well, obviously in the City Tavern, he stayed here quite some time before the British attacked Philadelphia and he moved out of Germantown, him and mother both. But what happens is the business environment at that era was male only. Now, having said it, there was dances. There was dance organized, especially during the British occupation. The socialites and the wannabe and the people who were important would be invited. They would be upstairs in the long room, and they would have dance. No question about it. But I don't think you would ever have seen just a lady or two to come in and grab a bite lunch. And kids, obviously, nobody's even heard of children even going out in that era. And obviously, that has long changed. Matter of fact, I had an award-winning children's menu in my restaurant. But so by and large, it was a male society. Interesting enough is that when you came to the tavern and you asked to spend the night, you did not get a key for a room. You got a chance to sleep. Now, there was 5 rooms upstairs, and by all accounts, up to 60 men would spend the night. Now, not want to gross you out, but tell you there was no WC, no water closets. It was chamber pots, and then the chamber pots have to be taken outside to clean. Just imagine that. There also was no police hours. They drank until nobody could walk, and that's why when you ever been to the tavern or other taverns, or when the tavern reopens, you'll see it again. It's where there is a gate on the bar, where the word grill, bar and grill comes from, because you were barring the guests from attacking the barkeep because they wanted more. No control on it, so that he would just close the gate, and henceforth there was it. But there wasn't even simple. Tankards would be flying around by all accounts, and obviously they consume the amount of liquor. And we see the beauty also, you have to remember, is that the research that was done from the government to get funding to rebuild this place, because remember, the place was no longer was a parking lot until people said, hey, we got to have that City Tavern for the 76, for the bicentennial, we got to have it. And so there was 20 years of research and a lot of documentation. The one thing what's really interesting, the Philadelphia Gazette, which was the only newspaper at the time, printed everything. So it was very easy to read, to find how much people consumed. It would actually list the bill, the tab. And if you would take what they had consumed at the time, give or take maybe a few percentage less or more, and people, none of us nowadays could stand next to them. They were absolutely consuming Madeira and punch and claret and champagne and rum in great excess. So obviously, and then they went upstairs and find a place to sleep. So there was it wasn't like going to a hotel and get a key to a room. No, you just had to find a place that you could pass the night.
Well, good thing there wasn't social media back then, huh?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Anyone else that had a question or a comment for Chef Staib? This has been amazing and so much fun, Chef Staib. Thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I did want to highlight, I did find, there they go. Can you see those?
Oh yeah, look at that.
Yes. Your books, City Tavern, the birthplace of American cuisine, Baking and Dessert Cookbook, Black Forest Cuisine, A Feast of Freedom, A Taste of History, City Tavern Cookbook, and The Sweet Taste of History. These,
You got all seven there, and now there's only four in print. It's City Tavern, A Sweet Taste of History, Black Forest, and A Taste of History. Yeah. And the Taste of History is the one that coincides, has recipes from all over, not just the United States,
okay.
but all made for a home cook. So all those recipes are there. But I think obviously the City Tavern one has a tremendous amount of history. There's about 34 pages that will explain to you the inner fabric of Old City Philadelphia. There's some beautiful renderings. Also, David McCullough, one of the premier historian of this country and a good friend, did that as well. He did the preface of the Sweet Taste of History as well. But yeah, the other two no longer available, but 4 out of 7 still can be, you can still have. And if you buy them to us, I'll autograph it to you. And actually, believe it or not, I take it to the post office myself every day.
Wow.
Phil, my assistant, rings it up, and I'll slap it to the post office. So
Good.
my contribution.
Okay, so I think we have everyone's email, so we will try to follow up with everyone to send that information out if they are interested in purchasing your books, if they don't already have them. So I will try to follow up with our curator to make sure that she follows up and sends that out. This was so awesome. I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss anything else from the chat. And if not, Chef Staib, thank you. I'm so glad to meet you. I don't get to watch TV, but now I'm going to deliberately look for you.
Well, one thing, it would have been nice if we didn't have to do this virtually, because it was initially planned to do there. And I was going to bring some sing along, maybe do a little demo, but hopefully soon we can be together again, because honestly, I'm no big fan of this, what do you call it, Zooming or whatever you want to call it. It's just unfortunate, but I will leave you with one thing though. I will tell you, everybody should be so proud of this great country that has been built. And I'm talking as an immigrant coming over here for 1 year. Think about it, and I'm still here. Now, nobody asked me why I'm still here. It's because I met a woman and I got married. Unfortunately, she passed away 5 years ago, but I was married for 47 years. We met in Chicago, and I was going to go back home because I had to take over a family business. And she wasn't too, I took her, she wasn't too crazy about, she was from Central America, Nicaragua. She wasn't too crazy about at the time, Germany and stuff like that. She said, hey, you're welcome to go. In other words, I could have gone back, but she wasn't going to come. So here you go. I think I did the right decision by staying here. And but I will tell you, from a purely culinary point of view, this country had a tremendous amount of stuff. Sometimes it gets forgotten in politics and what else have you, but it's just a fantastic, the history, the culinary history, what has happened over the years, and how hard the people worked to get us to the level that we're in today should never be underscored. People shouldn't take it for granted. Yeah, obviously, technology has come in like everything else. Like right now, we're talking to each other on something that we haven't thought about 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I mean, it was around, but so it definitely is a great country. And obviously, I'm here. I'm happy. I'm a big ambassador for America all over the world. I've traveled for our governor. I went to Berlin and cooked up pepper pot, believe it or not. Different things all over and in Asia as well. I've traveled a great deal. I've been from South Africa, you name it, I've been to it, and I've always promote the Northeast, especially Philadelphia. And I think now, especially that we became a World Heritage City, is so exciting for everybody. So keep your eyes open. You see me cooking in my own home kitchen to do a little pepper pot that's coming out. I think May 24th, they're starting a whole big program and celebrating, because this is a huge achievement, for the city. And Philadelphia, between the culture, between its great restaurants, its great chefs, and obviously the museums and the entertainment venue, it's just a spectacular city. Anybody who doesn't like it doesn't deserve to be here. Well, thank you very much for today. And like I said, anything that you ever need, just feel free to get a hold of Christine. Is there any other questions, Christine? Send an email to me and I'll follow up on it. Seriously, if there's something that's fell through the cracks.
Are going to be new friends. You like to cook and I love to eat. So that's
Very good. All right, well, thank you very much.
right. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Louise. Hopefully soon, Chef Staib, maybe we can get you to come back into the house and do some demonstrations. And I volunteer to taste test for you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you.